Rose spent a bit more time there, holding her mother tightly as she tried to calm herself down. Eventually, after about 15 minutes or so, she finally managed to cool off, at which point her mother invited her to go to sleep. After all, it had been a fairly stressful day, or eventful, however you want to call it. There, inside of the Sky-Ray home, they both laid down to try to get some rest. Snuggling in between them, a small yellow fluff ball of a plant dog, making itself comfortable pressing against Rose, as it curled into a little ball, and as the leaves furled in, enclosing them within it, and they gave off a very dim glow, much less so than when they were awake, making the light extremely gentle. Rose, her mother, and the small, fluffy dog found their way to rest there, underneath the tree that Rose and her mother had grown. In the house, unlike any other that Rose had ever slept in. But there, they did find some measure of peace for the time being. Rose was awoken by the sensation of a small animal licking her face. She awoke to find the fluffy little yellow dog barking and licking at her. "Fluff, what are you doing?" she said as she groaned, trying to pick herself up. As she looked around, she noticed that the flowery home that she was sleeping in had opened up wide, light now beaming in. As she looked to the other side of the center section of that Sky-Ray home, she saw her mother, her beautiful yellow petals extended as she sat there, her hair dimly glowing, along with the petals themselves, taking deep breaths. "Mom?" Rose said, trying to get her mother's attention. Her mother turned around. "Well, good morning, Rose. I'm glad that you're up. Did you sleep well?" "Yeah, I guess," Rose replied, before feeling a sharp twinge in her back as she tried to adjust herself. Was her rosebud hurting again? She thought as she reached back to check on it, and was panicked for a moment as she found that it had increased a great deal in size, more than 3 times the size it was before, larger than even a softball, now nearly the size of a dodgeball. "Ah! What happened?" Rose shouted, trying to look over her shoulder at the bulge towards the center of her back. "Calm down, Rose. Your bud has simply grown. It's perfectly natural, don't worry. That's the reason we're out here, sweetheart. We can't exactly have you going to school with a very large flower bud starting to protrude from your back." "Yeah," Rose replied. "I'm sorry, I'm still just getting used to all of this. It still kind of freaks me out a bit," Rose said, barely being able to see the edge of the bud as she looked over her shoulder. "Yes, you'll most likely bloom very soon. If not today, then tomorrow," her mother said as she approached Rose, taking a closer look at her back. "Your development is progressing quite rapidly. It might have taken a little bit longer were you a pure Sky-Ray, but it appears your father's influence has struck again. Your growth rate is much accelerated, most likely due to the increased nutrition that you've been ingesting. We Sky-Ray can only intake energy from the sun. While we are able to absorb and use this energy quite effectively, the energy of sunlight is still very limited. It is a slow-going process to absorb it, and then metabolize it. As you have no petals thus yet, the only way you can absorb the light is through your skin and hair, which only makes the process slower. which is in part why the process normally takes longer. But with the addition of your father's genetics, you're able to intake a great deal more nutrition and process that into your development. And so it's accelerated. It would probably take several more days at least if you were a natural sky ray. But with the rate of your growth, I'd say today or tomorrow at the latest. And you will no doubt be stricken with hunger again. Very soon you'll probably get the urge to go eat. Try not to be afraid, Rose. Understand, it doesn't matter how much you eat. Your body can process and metabolize food at a rate that no human ever could. So you won't endanger yourself no matter how much you eat. But until then, I suppose that I have no choice but to take your father's place and teach you of the Okar, as well as the Sky Ray. I'm not exactly an expert, but your father did tell me a great deal of information. So I'll do my best to explain it in the same way that he explained it to me. Come now, Rose, her mother said as she stood back up to her feet, offering her hand down to Rose, which she accepted, getting off of the ground hesitantly. So I'm going to learn about the Okar as well? And their abilities? Yes, Rose. It's important. It's clear and evident that you have a great deal that you've inherited from your father. Yesterday, I wasted all of our time on Sky Ray things. It was simply me, being selfish, trying to treat you only as my daughter and not as your father's daughter as well. It did make me feel a great deal more at home to be able to use our Sky Ray abilities together. But the time has come for you to learn of your father, his abilities, and how to use them for yourself. Based on the way he described them, the Okar abilities tend to be based on emotion, specific emotions and desires triggering them, which you'll have to learn to control. You'll understand why once we begin, Rose's mother said as she began to exit the Sky Ray home, walking across the gentle yellow petals. Rose and her little dog Fluff shortly following behind her, as her mother led her out, walking for a great deal of distance and leaving the tree that they had grown together behind, stepping out into the sunlight of the open space that was remaining within the clearing, and walking towards the edge of the clearing, where she could find more trees, but of a much smaller size than the one that now grew in the center of the clearing. Okay, this should do, her mother said, stopping before one of the medium-sized trees towards the exterior of the clearing. Okay, Rose, I'm going to have to teach you how to utilize your thorns, or at least do the best I can to do so. Remember, I'm basing this off of the way your father described the abilities, so there might be some measure of personal difference, meaning there's a good possibility that this will simply be a matter that you'll have to find yourself. Hopefully what your father told me could help, but in the end, as I am not an Okar, I cannot be very specific about any differences that may occur. I mean, are you sure we have to do this? Rose replied. I really don't like the idea of having thorns, Rose replied, hesitantly beginning to look at her hands, remembering the scans taken by the King of Atlantis, saying that they would most likely protrude from her fingertips. I'm afraid it's not an option, Rose. The Okar's abilities are based on emotional state, desire, and intention, meaning that your emotional state can affect those abilities, force them to become active, even in a situation where you might not want it. So, in order to ensure that you have control over them, you need to master them now, lest you accidentally use them in a very public place.